This is the smallest group I've had in a long time, and I'm very happy with that. So thank you, I guess, for all the other people who didn't show up. It's going to be a bit of an odd talk, because I woke up this morning and I can't move my neck anymore. So usually I turn a lot in a talk, but now I have to turn my whole body like a robot, so I'll look like a complete idiot, even more than usual. So don't pay attention to that. Les, who has heard of Les before? Okay, good. First, a bit of promotion. So there's a course later on this year. If you want to go, it's really good. That's about the promotion. Very short introduction. So I'm Bas, the original creator of LeSS. I live here in Singapore for probably another 2 more years, and then I've had enough of it. And I spend most of my time as a coach. Nowadays, I spend a lot of time at Credit Suisse here, which has been lots of fun. But most of the story is not about that. It's about other company I've worked with. The agenda for this talk looks like this. So 1, I'll talk a little bit about Scrum. 2, I talk a little bit about LeSS. And then 3, the majority of this talk, I'll talk about how and why LeSS was created, the story of how it was created. And that will take the majority of this talk. The first 2 topics I'll do relatively quickly. So first, Scrum. Any of you familiar with Scrum? Good. So most of the time when people think about Scrum, they think about this diagram or a variant of this diagram, sometimes called the flow diagram. And this is, can you make sure that you sit very close to me? This seat here is even free still. Thank you. So, and it's true that this picture is a picture of Scrum. However, it is also what at least I consider to be the least interesting view of Scrum. And there's many perspectives of Scrum. So, for example, this picture also explains Scrum, but in a very different way. And I think this picture is much more towards the essence of Scrum. So Scrum is very team-based. Not only that, we want the teams to be cross-functional. We want to set them free. We want them to manage themselves. And then last, these self-managing cross-functional teams will build a product in an incremental, iterative way. And there's no events or meetings or things like that in this picture, but to me it much better describes Scrum than the previous picture. Now, this one is also a picture of Scrum, but the one that we prefer not talking about too much, because if you adopt Scrum in an organization, usually that means abandoning functional groups, even abandoning functional departments. No company that I've used Scrum in that's using Scrum well has a QA group. That's kind of the first sign that something is wrong with your Scrum adoption is if somebody says, I'm on the QA team. But you know, what is the essence of Scrum? The essence of Scrum, to me, is this very simple idea where we're getting a group of people with all of the skills we need to build a product. We put them in contact with a customer or user. We ask them what they'd like to have most. We pick that up. We go and build that for 2 weeks. We stop. We show the product to the customer. We get feedback. We think about how we built it. Then we ask, what is the next important thing? We build it. We stop. We show the product. That's the essence of Scrum. Now, why is that important? Because if we talk about multiple teams and large scale, we don't really want to scale up the meetings, but we want to scale up that essence. We want to figure out how can we achieve that same dynamic, not with one team, but with many teams. Now, LeSS stands for Large Scale Scrum, and it has the same perspective. So the most common view of LeSS is this picture, which is the same as the Scrum flow picture, but then just with multiple teams in it. And I'd like to just very quickly go over it. So in LeSS, we have one product owner for the entire product. And this is really key. Product owners per team are considered to be a poor practice. Instead, you have a product owner for one product. We also have one product backlog for the entire product. The rest of the events are kind of similar. We start off with Sprint Planning 1, which is a shared event across multiple teams. Then Sprint Planning 2, the teams usually done in a multi-team fashion, all of the teams together in a big room, but then in separate corners, plan for the work they're going to do within the sprint. Then there's one sprint, and all of the teams will pick up some items during that, and during that one sprint, they have to constantly integrate and coordinate the work between those teams. Halfway the sprint, we briefly stop for a backlog refinement in which we look for the future items that are going to come. And usually this is also done with multiple teams together so that we maximize the view of the individual people to have what in LeSS is called this whole product focus. Then at the end of the sprint, there's one integrated shippable product. We have one sprint review where we show the product to customers and stakeholders. After that, the individual teams have their retrospectives, and then after that, there's only one additional event to LeSS than to Scrum, which is called the overall retrospective, in which management, product owners, Scrum Masters, and representatives of the team talk about systemic and organizational problems. There, and that's about it. So thank you very much for joining this session. That's it for agenda point 1 and 2, Scrum and LeSS. But so this session, let me start over again. So this session has an interesting history, which was actually, I think, in this building in one of the Agile Singapore conferences a couple years ago. At that, I also did a talk, and I did a talk about the introduction to LeSS. And I basically did the same as I just did, except that I added a lot more words so that it would take about an hour. And I thought it was pretty good. It was also recorded, so just like this video, let me talk into the camera. Just like this video, I've never done that, talk in the camera. That's a new thing. Yeah. So just like this video, it's also online. And after the talk, I went to a colleague of mine, Louis, and I asked him, so what do you think of the talk? And he said, wow, this is a challenge. So I wanted to change the talk completely and try to figure out how I can talk about a framework without being boring. So now, congratulations, you've survived the boring part of this talk. The rest of the talk will be interesting. So in thinking about talks that I liked, one of the things that made a good talk is lots of stories. So therefore, I decided the rest of this talk will be one long story. Actually, there will be multiple stories. Let me start drinking some coffee. Let me start off with a story of this guy. Does anyone know who that is? Yeah, exactly alike, right? Yeah. Yes, so that's my son. I always try to put him in talks. And as you can see, he's a Star Wars fan. Did anyone watch the Solo movie yet? Yeah? Are you still enjoying Star Wars after watching the Solo movie?
I'm trying to forget what I watched.
Yeah, so let's see if we need to take him there. So, but I'd like to start with a story about him, because I often have long conversations with him. You can learn a lot from children. But one of the funniest conversations for me was a couple of years ago when we were traveling back from here in Singapore, back from his swimming lesson to our home. And we were stuck in traffic. And he is annoyed, and he's sitting in the back of the car, and he's looking at the cars and the speed, and he says, "Papa, I want to go faster." And I said, "That's very nice, but we're stuck in traffic. Our car can't fly, we can't go through it, so we won't be going any faster." So, but then he looked at the other side of the road, and there was no traffic there, so he pointed to the other side of the road and said, "But they are going faster." And I said, "Yeah, they're going faster, but they are going in the wrong direction." Right? We have a choice here, which is we can go slowly into the right direction, or we can go very fast into the wrong direction. What do you want to do? So he thought it over a bit, and he said, "I want to go very fast in the wrong direction." And at that point, I thought it was just funny. But then, the next day I was thinking about it a little bit, and I suddenly realized that that probably is the best analogy I know for our industry. Because when I work with companies, most companies are obsessed about productivity and velocity and things like that, about going faster, but they rarely stop and think whether they're actually going in the right direction. So unless the purpose is explicitly not efficiency and productivity, if we become more productive accidentally, that is nice, but the focus is on agility, flexibility, and value delivery, the going in the right direction, because that is much more important. So LeSS starts about now almost 15 years ago. So almost 15 years ago, I was working in Nokia, not the Nokia phone side, but the Nokia network side. Not for this product, but I worked for this product also, but later. And at that time, I was living in China, and Nokia wanted to start agile iterative development. They didn't really know what it was, but they wanted to start experimenting with it. And they looked in the organization for somebody with agile development experience, and they found me. And I don't claim to be the only one with agile development experience at that time, but I do claim to be the only findable person with agile development experience. So they asked me, "Do you want to run this agile change project?" And I said yes, before they told me that I had to move to Helsinki, Finland. For those who've never been in Finland, do not go. It is really cold there. So, but I said yes already, so I moved to Finland to start this agile iterative change project, only to discover that they really had no idea what it was yet, and they had no idea what they wanted to do. So therefore, the first thing that we did is we started working with this person, a person called Larman, now a good friend of mine. We started working with him because he had written this book. So this book is 2002, I think. and it was a summary of everything related to agile iterative development at that time, but a little bit. So everything agile a little bit. And that was perfect for an organization who didn't know what they wanted to do. So we started working with him. And the first things that we did is we just started having sessions with hundreds of people. And he would give a one-day introduction, first explaining iterative, incremental development, agile development, then Scrum, extreme programming, things that are not used anymore, luckily, like DSDM and feature-driven development, then go over all the technical practices, refactoring, test-driven development, continuous integration, etc., etc., etc. And then after giving everything, a little bit of agile, a little bit of everything agile, we asked the product group, so what do you want to do? And most of the product groups would say, well, this extreme programming thing, that is a little bit too extreme. We don't want to do that. But this Scrum thing sounds really easy. So we're like, okay. So we started working with Scrum and started working with also Ken Schwaber, the creator of Scrum at that time. But we had two big problems. Problem one, in Nokia there was no product that was developed with one team. And Scrum was described as this one team framework. And two, Craig had been a bit too successful, and we didn't have one product that wanted to try it, but we had about 20 products that wanted to try it, and there were about 1.5 coaches to support that. So in order to survive that, so we had no idea what to do, in order to survive that, we did the only thing that we could do, which is we just started experimenting. We went to one product group, we tried to understand the problems that they had, we suggested an experiment, then we went to another product group, we listened to the situation that they're in, suggested an experiment, and then after 2 weeks came back to the first one again, got some feedback on how it went, talked about that, suggested a new experiment, etc. And we kind of went on for a couple of years like that, trying out many different things in parallel. And some of those things were really, really stupid, and you should never do them. And now we know because we did them. And some of them turned out to be really good, and they're now part of what we call LeSS. However, when you do experiments, you need to figure out where do you get the ideas to experiment. So during this time, we would also read everything about product development, not so much agile development, but just product development in general. But the things that we were interested in were experience reports of successful products, not people saying, I think it should be like this, but people saying, you know, this is how we've done that. And specifically, the ones from Microsoft in the 90s were very important, specifically these two, because in the 90s, Microsoft knew how to build software. In the 90s, they did. Did anyone ever read these? Okay. So, which one?
Second one.
The second one. Okay. So the first one, debugging the development process, is basically the description of how they worked in the Microsoft Excel version 1 project. And this was a very significant project because Microsoft released Excel, and they, within a year or so, they took over the market from, and anyone knows that? Lotus, 1, 2, 3. And then the second one is the description of the Microsoft Visual C++ project, version 1, which is a similar project because they released that and they overnight took over the market for C++ compilers from Borland, yes, exactly. So they were very significant projects. And two important concepts were described in, especially this one, which I will focus on, and that was daily builds and continuous integration. Now, let me first take a step back and talk a little bit about extreme programming. So extreme programming, one of the most important agile development frameworks, is called extreme programming because they took good practices to the extreme. So one of the biggest influences for extreme programming was exactly these projects, where they started the good practice of daily builds, and they took that to the extreme, and that became continuous integration, and today continuous delivery. So daily builds and this idea of feature teams, which I'll get back to in a moment. Then another important influence was this obscure paper called XP and Large Distributed Projects by a company called Ericsson, which was about the #1 competitor of Nokia at that time. So once you are trying agile development in a large telecom company and your major competitor starts publishing papers about that, you start paying attention. And we read this paper the first time and it was not very interesting. And then we read it again and it was not very interesting. And then we read it for the third time and then we were like, hey, they're onto something, but they're not realizing how important it is yet. And specifically, they talked about feature teams and daily builds. Again, the same techniques going hand in hand. Now, feature teams is one of the essential parts of LeSS. When you adopt LeSS, it means you must adopt a feature team structure. Who's familiar with the idea of feature teams? Let me explain the concept as briefly, as quickly as I can. So traditional organizations tend to be organized around the architecture. We call that component organizations. Component teams, which basically means if you print out an architecture diagram and an org chart, and if they're similar, you have component teams. Now, component teams leads to a couple of problems, and I'll demonstrate them by an example. So the simplest component team scenario is where we have an application of both a front end and a back end. So we're going to just simulate that by creating a front end team and a back end team. So these 5 people, do you want to be a front end or a back end team?
Front end.
Good choice. So then these 4 people, I'm sorry, you are the back end team. And I know that's not hot and cool today, but that's too bad. So then we need a product owner. So let me take him, he's the product owner. How does that feel? Sorry?
Quite stressful.
Stressful. You know, just by calling somebody a product owner, I've stressed him out already. So the product owner prioritizes the product backlog, and on the product backlog there should be customer-centric items, not tasks, right? Now, unfortunately, this product owner, he doesn't care about the architecture, and he wants features that include both front-end and back-end. Annoying product owner. And not only that, he doesn't prioritize the items so that the front-end work and the back-end work are equally balanced. Right? So now we get a couple of problems. The first problem is we get dependencies between teams. And I always thought dependencies between teams is one of the main problems to solve when scaling agile development. And only the last couple of years I realized that I was wrong, and dependencies between teams are actually not a problem. But what is a big problem is what we call asynchronous dependencies, right? And I'll just quickly demonstrate that. So the product owner has prioritized features on the top of the backlog that require lots of front-end work, but not so much back-end work. So now this team will work on the most important features. But this team will unfortunately not work on the most important features. They work on some lower priority items. But the lower priority features, they still require front-end work too, right? But now, this is key, this team will not work on it at the same time, because from their perspective, they have more important features to work on. So what now happens is that this team will do their part of this feature. They will integrate it within the system and leave it half done. Then this team, a couple of sprints later, will do their part of that feature. They will try to integrate it with the work of this team, and of course that will never work. So then this team will start interrupting this team, and this team will be annoyed about that, because they are working on other items right now. Right? If they have an over-enthusiastic Scrum Master, he might kick them out and say interruption. Just to be clear, that would be a very bad thing. Right? So you get this conflict between the teams during the sprint. And now we have only 2 teams. If you add more teams, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. Right? Now, the way to solve these is not through planning more, which is the traditional way of trying to resolve that, but through structuring the teams differently. And we're going to do that. So can you two please get up and move there? Can you two please get up and move there? And take all your things with you, because this is a permanent move. Yeah. So please move over there. You guys move over here. There we go. Done. Now we have 2 what we would call feature teams, which is we have 2 teams with both front-end and back-end skills. We didn't change anything in the skills of people, we just put them together in a different way. Now, the product owner can give a feature to this team, and this team will be responsible for implementing the entire feature. They have no dependencies whatsoever to this team. And the product owner can give a feature to this team, and they work on the entire feature without dependencies to that team. Right? All problems solved, except that both of these teams now work on the same components during the sprint at the same time. Right? So they still have sort of dependencies, but these dependencies are related to the code and not related to the requirements. Now, the dependencies related to code are much better to have because, well, for one, they happen at the same time. Right? If this team needs to change a component in the front end, and this team needs to change the same component in the front end, then they only have a dependency when they need to change those components at the same time. If this team needs to change it in sprint 1, and this team in sprint 2, no dependency. Right? And those kind of dependencies, which we sometimes refer to as synchronous dependencies, they are actually good to have, because it allows the teams to work together on the same product. Now, also, that immediately explains why daily builds and feature teams and daily builds always showed up together in the, I guess, the history of software development. Because the daily build and automated tests were enabling multiple teams to work on shared code. So we tried it out first with 1 team, and then with 3 teams, and then with 5 teams, and then with 10 teams, and we just scaled that up, and for whatever size, it worked really, really well. And therefore, feature teams became a major part of LeSS. And this is important because LeSS is very much about structuring your organization, and not so much about, you know, the events and meetings and things like that. Okay, back to the story. 2 years in Finland was more than enough. And I decided to leave. I left Finland, moved back to China, joined a large product group of about 450 people there, changed that product to what we then just called large Scrum. We didn't have any better name. And then I left China because it still had winters. And I moved to Singapore, where there's no winters ever. It's really, really nice. And I had to leave Nokia, so became an external coach. They did hire me back. And then at some point in time, Craig said to me, let's write a book. And I didn't know yet that the correct answer was no. So I said, okay, and we, so skip that. We wrote these 2 books, which are literally a catalog of experiments. So 1,000 pages of stuff that we tried out. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And did anyone ever read them? That's too bad. They're really good. I'm slightly biased here. So we read those and we got feedback about them. We first got mostly positive feedback and some not so positive feedback. And of course, the not so positive feedback is as authors, we considered that the people who read them are not smart enough to understand our great books. And then we realized that that is not the right attitude towards feedback. And we started exploring the less positive comments also. And we started exploring that based on the Shu-Ha-Ri model. Who's familiar with the Shu-Ha-Ri model? Okay. So Shu-Ha-Ri, well known in the Agile industry, it's a model for learning where Shu, you are a beginner. Ha, you become a beginning expert. Actually, let me get back to Shu. You're a beginner, and as a beginner, you need rules to follow. Then Ha, you're a beginning expert or an expert beginner, and you learn when you can break rules and when you should follow them. And then Ri, you are the expert and the one basically creating the rules. And the feedback that we got was, thank you for these 2 books. There are 1,000 pages of experiments, and after reading them, I do not know what to do. Because not once did you say, you must do this. And not once did you say, you should start with this. I have just lots of ideas, and I don't know what to do with them. So in interpreting that feedback based on the Shu-Ha-Ri model, we realized that we'd written the books for Ha-Ri level. We realized that we had actually made a huge mistake, and that is we had written the books for us. We had written the books that we would like to read at that time, right? And not for people who started scaling agile development. So we had this problem, and we had to think that over a little bit, but we realized that there's a reason why we didn't have any prescription, and that is we don't want people to follow rules. Because once people start following rules, they just do as the process says, do as the rule says, and they stop thinking. They don't own it, and they will not improve it. So we want people to experiment and not just follow rules, which is why we don't want any rules. But if we don't create rules, then people don't start. And if people don't start, they will not be able to experiment either. So we need to have some rules. But if we do, they follow them. And we don't want that. So we have this conflict. And we realize suddenly that this conflict between prescription and ownership had been solved, and it had been solved by Scrum. Because Scrum adds a lot of prescription to the absurdness of you have to stand for 15 minutes and answer 3 questions. But it adds the prescription at the points where it creates transparency. And therefore, the prescription creates transparency, creates feedback, and allows the team to take more ownership. So therefore, what we had to figure out is what prescription can we add to, on a larger scale, to create that same feedback dynamic so that the teams, multiple teams, can take ownership for how they work instead of just following a process. And we ended up creating the LeSS rules. This is one of the earlier versions of that. And there's very few of them. There's very less of them. There's about 3 pages in total. And that's kind of the minimum thing that you need to do when you start adopting LeSS. Then Craig asked, let's write a new book. And I said, no. I had learned writing a book is a pain in the ass. It takes a very long time, and it's no fun at all. It's fun in the day 1, and it's fun in the last day when you're done. But everything in between is just really painful. So I said no, and he said, and I said no. And he said, this one will be easy, because we just take ideas we wrote already and edit them together. And I said, okay, especially because my second son was about to be born, a couple months still. So the goal was to finish the book before he was born, and it got published when he was 3 years old. You kind of missed that schedule. And the third book is guides that explain the effect of the rules to organizations. So kind of the prequel to the other 2. Then we decided we want one more thing, and we want to have some principles. And we did something that is different than usual, which is we looked at all the experiments that were successful, and we extracted the principles that we followed. So we created the principles retrospectively out of the experiments. Those are the 10 principles. And we ended up with this view, which is our favorite view of LeSS, which is the essence of LeSS is experiments and an experimental mindset. Right? That's the, if you wish, the most important. Then there are a few minimal structure or rules, the frameworks. All of the experiments are guided by the principles, and then the guides help you to understand how to implement the rules to organizations. And this is what we call LeSS, or the LeSS complete picture. So now, to go back to the beginning of this talk, we started off with Scrum, and we discovered there's all these different perspectives of Scrum. And then we looked at LeSS, and we looked at the flow perspective of LeSS. But now, by going over its history, we discovered all these different perspectives also, right? We have the flow perspective, we have the LeSS complete picture, we have the experimental mindset, we have the structural part where we talk about how teams must be formed, we have the self-managing, self-organization part on just a much larger scale, and then we have the principles, with probably the most important one being the more with less principle. And I believe you're going to hold up the 5 more minutes sign.
Yes, next one.
Is it not now? Otherwise my timing is off.
So I can do the roundup if you want.
What is roundup?
Just wrap it up.
Now, don't you have a 5 minutes one?
Yeah, we have a 5 minutes one.
You don't have a 5 minutes one?
No, we have.
Oh, there. Show the 5 minutes one then. Okay, good. Thank you. So for the last 5 minutes, I'd like to explore the more with less principle, so one of the most important principles. And I'd like to introduce that by this quote. So this is a quote which I took from a book called Balancing Agility with Discipline. Has anyone ever read that? Good? Don't bother. It's not a very good book. But it's an interesting book because of the authors. Because one of the authors is a guy called Barry Beam. And he's been in our industry forever. Probably the most influential person in our industry ever. But if you trace back the history of waterfall development, you always end up with him. So he's probably one of the inventors of waterfall development, although he will never admit that, writing a book about agile development, which is also why it's not very good, because he's not really getting the point. But he comes with this very different perspective, and therefore every now and then he has some of this major insight. And one of them was, build your method up, don't tailor it down. And what he meant with that is that in our industry, we've been wrong over the last 50 years when we think about processes. Because in large organizations, we tend to create these really big processes, then give them to the organization and say, here's the process that will solve everything. But don't worry, you don't need to use all of that. You need to tailor it down. You need to remove the parts you don't need. And he said, that's a mistake. And I'll get back to that in a moment. The one thing that we need to learn from agile development is to find the absolute minimum, the minimum core, give that to organizations and say, you need to do at least this. You never need to remove from it, but if you're in pain, and only if you're in true pain, you can add to it, right? You can build it up, but you never have to tailor it down. Unfortunately, it seems that the Agile community has forgotten that advice recently. Now, why is this so important? The reason is that whenever you come with a big process, you give that to an organization, usually at that point in time it's a new process, new product, new people, new technology. So the organization has the least amount of knowledge. So with what knowledge are they going to make these tailoring down decisions? The effect of that is that they look at the big process and they say, in our project, do we need a release train conductor? Right? And they go like, well, we don't really know, right? So let's keep it just to play safe. Let's keep it. The effect of this is that you end up with much more processes, artifacts, and roles than you actually need. And that's the essence of the more with less principle, which is traditionally organizations think that more processes, roles, and artifacts cause no harm. And the more with less principle is the realization that adding more roles, processes, and artifacts causes a lot of harm to organizations. And because it's only 2 minutes left, you know 2 minutes sign?
No. It's round up.
It's round up time. So because it's only 2 minutes round up time left, I'll only take the roles in this case. So if you think about roles in an organization, a role in an organization is a set of responsibilities that I give to a certain individual. But when you create a role in an organization, you didn't create those responsibilities. Instead, you move them away. So every time when you create a new role, it means you take the responsibilities from one place and you give it to an individual person. And where do you take these responsibilities away from? Usually the teams. So therefore, the more roles you create within an organization, the less responsibility you have within the teams, the less responsible teams. Now, there's a similar effect in processes and artifacts. It takes away ownership and customer-centricness from the teams. And in LeSS, we don't want that. We want to create simpler organizations, avoid a lot of roles, artifacts and processes, and try to make sure that the teams own their ways of working and take responsibility and work close with actual customers. And with that, do you have a sign saying time up? Is that the sign for time up? And thanks for all. Do we have time for one question or not?
Yes, we have time.
Do you have the time for one question, sign? Oh, okay. If there's one question, I can take one question.
Yes, maybe we can take 2 questions.
2 questions. If there's 2 questions, I can take 2.
Let's say 3 questions. Sure.
Go ahead, ask the question.
Okay.
Can we do something about the speak? Is that here or the room next to
I
us?
think that is the other room.
Oh, okay. Not our problem.
Okay, my question is for multiple teams. For the sprint planning, is it better to do it separately or together?
So in LeSS, sprint planning is done together separately.
Together or separately?
No, it's done together separately. No, I'm very serious. So sprint planning is usually done within one large room, if you have that. In Credit Suisse, we started using the office space because we don't have enough good rooms. All of the teams together, but then the teams in a corner do their own sprint planning. But they're in the same space and they do it at the same time. And the effect of that is that they do it separately, but there's this constant interaction across the teams. Right? So for example, we did a sprint planning on Wednesday because of the Vesak day on Tuesday. We had all of the teams together and they went off, and suddenly one of the team realizes that all the items that they're working on are related. So they took their board of sprint planning, they took it in the center of the room, and they changed the sprint planning to a conversation with all 5 teams together for about half an hour or so to figure out, the larger picture of the design, what the individual teams are working on, and then they went off again to their own corners in the room. Does that answer your question?
Building the feature team, right? What
Yeah.
would be the number of, I would say, the critical size of the team that you
Same as in Scrum. When LeSS, it's not different. To me, it just depends a lot on the team itself. Like sometimes you have a team of 4 people and they're too big, and sometimes you have a team of 15 people and they work fine. So I usually stick with the traditional Scrum recommendation of, 3 to 9 or something, and LeSS is not any different than that, because that is sort of based on research. Last question.
Do you have a recommendation of things that has been experimented?
Do I have a recommendation of what?
Books or things to read as to what experiment has been done and didn't work?
Sorry about that. In our books, we also wrote the experiments that didn't work. So they're not the completely stupid ones. We skip those. But it's structured in try and avoid. And try basically means, whenever you're in this context, you can try this out, and it worked for us. And avoid is, we were having this problem, we were in this context, we tried this out, didn't work, don't do that. So we also want to document the things that didn't work, but we want to always associate it to the context so that you remove the idea of, you know, context-independent best practices. Answered? Good. That's it. That's our question quota for today.
Yes, unfortunately.
Sorry?
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, that's our question quota for today. Thank you very much. Have fun at the rest of the conference.